Mark Davis hadn't expected anything unusual when he stopped by the luxury hotel to fix a malfunctioning security system. As a struggling single dad trying to rebuild his life after losing everything, he only wanted to finish the job and get paid. But while passing through a crowded conference hall, the powerful CEO, Victoria Sterling, briefly looked at him and secretly signed two shocking words with her fingers. "Help me." Before he could react, her bodyguards rushed her away. Everyone else saw a confident billionaire. Mark saw something different. Fear. And that silent plea would pull him into a deadly secret, worth millions. Mark Davis was not the kind of man anyone noticed twice. He was 38 years old, lean from years of skipping meals he couldn't afford, with the kind of tired eyes that come not from laziness, but from carrying too much for too long. 3 years ago, he had been a senior cybersecurity analyst at a mid-sized tech firm in Chicago, a stable career, a modest house in the suburbs, a marriage that had once felt solid as concrete. Then, in the span of 14 months, his wife left, the company downsized, and a failed business venture wiped out what little savings remained. He was left with two things: his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, and a skill set he could monetize one contract at a time. He had no office, no business cards, just a battered laptop, a toolkit in the back of a second-hand pickup truck, and a reputation earned slowly, through referrals and honest work, as someone who could fix what others couldn't. He paid for Lily's after-school care with gig income. He paid rent 2 weeks late most months. He did not complain about this. He simply moved forward, because standing still was not something he could afford. The call had come in on a Tuesday. A property management contractor needed a freelance technician to inspect and repair a surveillance system at the Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, a 5-star property with marble floors, a rooftop bar, and the kind of quiet opulence that made a man in work boots feel like he had entered the wrong universe. The job was straightforward. Assess signal dropout in 3 camera clusters on the 2nd and 3rd floors. Replace any faulty hardware, and test the network relay. It was the kind of work Mark could do in his sleep. He accepted it without hesitation. The pay was good enough to cover rent and buy Lily new sneakers. He arrived early that Wednesday morning, checked in with the facilities manager, and was handed a temporary access badge and a work order. The hotel was already buzzing. Signs in the lobby directed guests toward the grand ballroom, where a large corporate conference was underway, the kind of event that drew executives in tailored suits and assistants with earpieces. Mark barely glanced at the signs. He had a job to do. He took the service elevator to the 2nd floor, laid out his tools, and began working methodically through the camera network, testing signal strength and tracing the dropout fault to a damaged relay hub near the east stairwell. He was efficient and quiet, the way experienced technicians tend to be, making himself invisible in the background of other people's important days. It was during his second sweep of the hallway, when he needed to pass through the outer corridor of the grand ballroom to reach the 3rd floor access panel, that everything changed. The conference was in a break between sessions, and the corridor was thick with attendees in motion, glasses of water in hand, phones pressed to ears. Mark moved along the wall, his tool bag slung over one shoulder, focused on the access panel at the far end. And then, without planning it, without reason, he glanced toward the center of the hall. A cluster of people stood there, and at the center of that cluster was a woman he recognized immediately, not because he knew her personally, but because her face had been on the cover of 3 national business magazines in the last year alone. Victoria Sterling. 51 years old. Founder and CEO of Sterling Capital Group, a privately held conglomerate with holdings in real estate, logistics, and clean energy. Her net worth, according to the most recent estimates, exceeded $4 billion. She had been profiled as one of the most powerful self-made women in American business. She stood in the corridor now with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room back straight, expression composed, a faint smile on her lips, as a man in a gray suit spoke to her. She was flanked by 2 large men in dark jackets, who held their hands clasped in front of them with the practiced stillness of professional bodyguards. Mark looked at her for no more than 2 seconds. It was the kind of glance any person gives a notable figure in a crowded space, brief, involuntary, then over. But in those 2 seconds, something happened that Mark Davis would not be able to explain rationally for the rest of his life. Victoria Sterling's eyes found his. Not the eyes passing across a room kind of contact, but a direct, deliberate lock, one human being looking at another with full conscious intention. And then, in the space below the sightline of the man speaking to her, below the awareness of the bodyguards on either side, her right hand moved. The fingers shaped themselves with practiced precision into a sequence that Mark recognized immediately from the year he had spent learning American Sign Language alongside a deaf colleague at his old firm. 2 words, clear as any spoken sentence. "Help me." He stopped walking. He did not mean to. His feet simply ceased to move. He stood there with his tool bag on his shoulder and stared at a woman who was already looking away. Already nodding at something the man in the gray suit had said. Her hand back at her side, as if nothing had happened. Less than 4 seconds later, one of the bodyguards stepped smoothly to her left, placed a guiding hand against the small of her back, and began steering her toward the conference room entrance. She did not look back. Mark waited for it, that natural human impulse to glance over the shoulder when you've said something important to someone. She did not do it, and somehow, that restraint told him more than the gesture itself. He stood in the corridor for another 30 seconds, before a passing attendee excused himself around Mark's stationary frame. And the physical interruption broke whatever had frozen him in place. He walked to the access panel, opened it, and stared at the wiring inside without seeing it for a full minute. His mind was running the same loop. What he had seen, whether he had seen it correctly, what it could possibly mean, and what the most rational explanation was for a billionaire CEO to sign 2 desperate words at a maintenance technician she had never met. He came up with nothing that satisfied him. He finished his work, packed his tools, and submitted his report to the facilities manager. He did not mention what he had seen. He drove home, picked up Lily from after-school care, made pasta for dinner, and helped her with a worksheet on fractions. He told himself it was nothing. He almost believed it. By the next morning, Mark had constructed a reasonable explanation for what he had witnessed. Stress. The woman ran a $4 billion company. She was probably exhausted, possibly performing under enormous pressure, and his interpretation of her hand gesture had almost certainly been a projection, his own pattern recognition firing on a few random finger movements across a crowded corridor. He was a man trained to find anomalies in systems, and sometimes that instinct misfired in human contexts. He was confident of this explanation for approximately 4 hours, until he went back to the hotel to submit the final paperwork for his repair work and, while waiting in the facilities office, made a casual request of the hotel's operations manager that changed everything. He asked if he could do a quick post-installation check of the camera feeds to verify the relay fix had held. The operations manager, a harried man named Greg who was clearly juggling 3 problems at once, waved him toward the monitoring room without hesitation. Mark sat down at the system console and pulled up the archived footage from the conference corridor, not because he was looking for anything specific, but because it was professional habit. He scrubbed back to the window of time when he had passed through the hallway, watched the footage, confirmed his repair had fixed the signal dropout, and was about to close the interface when his eye caught something in the edge of the frame he hadn't noticed at the time. In the corner of the wide-angle shot, partially obscured by a structural column, a man stood watching the crowd. He wasn't a conference attendee, he wore no lanyard, no badge. He wasn't hotel staff, he wore a dark civilian jacket and held no clipboard, no radio, no visible purpose. He was simply standing, arms loose at his sides, watching, and specifically, Mark noticed, watching Victoria Sterling. The man's body was angled toward her with the unmistakable focus of someone tracking a target. Mark rewound and watched the segment again. During the period when Victoria's hand had moved the 2 seconds Mark had been standing in the corridor, the man behind the column had shifted his weight forward slightly. As if he had noticed something, as if he had been watching for exactly that kind of movement from her. Mark pulled up the hotel's guest registry system through the admin interface. He still had temporary access from the work order and searched for a record matching the man's physical description. Nothing. He checked the conference attendee list that had been uploaded into the hotel's coordination folder. The man's face, which Mark had captured in a still from the footage and was examining carefully, appeared nowhere. He was in the building without a record. Mark ran the timestamp against the camera network metadata for the 20-minute window surrounding the conference break, the precise window when Mark had seen Victoria sign. There was a gap in the footage from the camera, positioned closest to the room where Victoria had been meeting privately before the break. The gap was clean, clinical, exactly the kind of deletion that doesn't happen by accident. Someone had removed that footage, and whoever had done it understood the system well enough to do it without triggering the standard error flags. Mark stared at the screen for a long moment. He thought about asking Greg about the gap. He thought about calling the non-emergency police line. He thought about how both of those conversations would go: a freelance technician telling a hotel manager and a dispatcher that a famous billionaire had signed 2 words at him, and that he'd found a clean data gap in a camera feed, and that this all added up to something very wrong. He imagined the expressions. He closed the interface, thanked Greg for the access, and walked out of the hotel into the cold Chicago morning. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes without starting the engine. Then he drove home and began doing what he was actually trained to do. The next several days unfolded with a quietness that felt increasingly wrong. Mark pulled what public information he could about Sterling Capital Group SEC filings, press releases, property records, board announcements. On the surface, the company was doing well. Quarterly earnings were strong. A recent acquisition of a logistics firm in the Southeast had been covered enthusiastically by financial media. Victoria Sterling had given 2 interviews in the past 6 weeks, both polished, both projecting the calm authority of a CEO, fully in command of her enterprise. Nothing was visibly wrong, and yet Mark's instincts, honed by years of looking at systems from the inside out, kept snagging on details that a casual observer would pass over entirely. He cross-referenced 3 months of public appearances by Victoria Sterling and found something that, individually, meant nothing, but as a pattern, was striking. She had canceled or postponed 11 engagements in the last 8 weeks, board dinners, industry panels, charitable events she had committed to publicly. The explanation offered by her communications team in each case had been vague: scheduling conflicts, minor health considerations, travel complications. Taken separately, each cancellation was unremarkable. The pattern, however, told a different story. Victoria Sterling, by every prior account, was a woman of iron discipline who honored her commitments. The sudden erosion of that pattern suggested not scheduling chaos but something being imposed on her schedule from outside. He also began paying close attention to the company's internal structure by reading between the lines of public filings and news coverage. There were small things: an unusual consolidation of administrative authority under the operations division, a renegotiated facilities contract that routed building security responsibilities through a subsidiary few people had ever heard of, and a change in the company's communications protocols that had been quietly announced in an internal memo, leaked to a trade publication, and then quickly walked back. These were not, in themselves, the kind of things that made headlines. But to someone who had spent years stress-testing security architectures, they read as the deliberate construction of a controlled environment, a system designed not to keep threats out but to keep one person in. Meanwhile, the hotel's camera network continued to show the same clean gap at the same timestamp from the same date, untouched and unexplained, and the man without a badge had left no digital footprint in any system Mark could access. It was as if he had walked through the hotel the way a ghost walks through a wall, present only in the sliver of footage Mark had already seen. He told himself he was overthinking it. He took a small IT contract for a dental office, fixed a router configuration issue for a restaurant group, picked Lily up from school 3 days in a row, and made a deliberate effort to let the whole thing go. But the image of Victoria Sterling's hand, the precise, controlled, desperate movement of those 2 words would not leave him. He had spent a year learning sign language. He knew what he had read. And something in him, some stubborn fault line in his character, that had always made him bad at looking away from things that mattered, would not let him pretend otherwise. He had seen a woman ask for help. He had seen fear behind a composed face. He had seen an empty space in a camera record where evidence should have been. These were not the components of nothing. The email arrived on a Thursday night at 11:47, to an address Mark used only for freelance inquiries not listed anywhere public, obtainable only through the contractor database the hotel's facilities team used. The subject line was blank. The body contained 2 sentences and a set of coordinates. Don't believe what the press says about her. Come alone. The coordinates resolved to an address on the south side of the city, a commercial district that had been half redeveloped and half abandoned, with a parking structure that had been closed for renovation for the better part of 2 years. Mark read the email 4 times. He checked the sending address against every database he had access to. It traced to a temporary encrypted relay that had already been deactivated. Whoever sent it knew exactly how to cover their digital tracks. He went. He told himself later that this had been a reckless decision, and it was. But he also knew, with the clarity that occasionally arrives in the middle of the night, that if he ignored this message and something happened to Victoria Sterling, he would carry that weight for the rest of his life. He drove to the parking structure at 1 in the morning, parked on the street, walked in through the open vehicle gate, and stood in the dim concrete interior, listening to the wind move through the open levels above him. He waited 6 minutes, then footsteps careful, measured came from the stairwell behind him, and a figure emerged from the shadows. Victoria Sterling looked nothing like the woman who had been on the cover of those magazines. She was wearing jeans and a dark jacket. No makeup. Her hair pulled back without care. She looked tired in a way that wealth could not cushion the kind of tired that comes from sustained fear. She stopped 10 feet away from Mark and studied him for a moment with the same evaluating attention she had directed at him in the hotel corridor. Then she said, quietly and without preamble, that she needed him to understand several things before she said anything else. She had been under continuous surveillance for the past 3 months, not by law enforcement, but by people inside her own company. Her phone had been cloned. Her private calendar was being monitored. Every meeting she attended was observed by at least one person she did not trust. She had tried twice to contact law enforcement through indirect channels, and both attempts had been intercepted before reaching anyone outside the company's sphere of influence. She had no one on the outside she could safely reach. And then she had seen him a technician. Someone with no connection to Sterling Capital. No stake in the corporate structure, no reason to be implicated, and she had done the only thing she could think of in a moment of desperate calculation. Mark asked her who was watching her. She opened her mouth to answer, and then, from the upper level of the parking structure, headlights swept across the open ceiling, and the sound of a heavy engine dropped toward the entrance ramp with sudden, deliberate speed. Victoria's face went rigid. She said one word, "Run," and moved. Not toward Mark, not toward his car, but laterally, deeper into the structure, and toward a fire exit on the far wall. He watched her go, saw the SUV's lights flooding the vehicle gate, and made an instantaneous decision to move in the opposite direction, back to the street entrance, where he slipped out between 2 concrete pillars as the vehicle turned in. He did not run. Running draws attention. He walked to his truck, drove 2 blocks, pulled over, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel, his heart hammering, until the sound of the SUV engine faded. He did not know if Victoria had gotten out safely. He did not know who had been in that vehicle. He drove home in a silence that felt like the inside of a locked room. The thing about Mark Davis was that fear had never made him stop. It had slowed him. Sometimes had made him careful in ways that looked, from the outside, like hesitation. But the fear he felt after that night in the parking structure did not slow him. It focused him. He returned to what he knew: systems, data, the digital archaeology of financial records. He had spent 4 years auditing corporate network infrastructure before his career had shifted to security. He knew how to read the underlying architecture of a company's financial data without direct access to their servers. Because public companies left traces in regulatory filings that, assembled carefully, told stories their communications teams never intended to tell. Sterling Capital Group, though technically private, had subsidiaries that intersected with publicly traded entities and were therefore subject to partial disclosure requirements. Mark spent the next 5 days going through every available document with the methodical patience of someone who had nothing else to do at 2 in the morning after Lily was asleep. What he found was not one smoking gun but a pattern of smaller anomalies that, taken together, were damning. Over a 30-month period, 3 Sterling Capital subsidiaries had recorded substantial write-downs on assets that independent property assessments conducted for unrelated refinancing purposes and filed with county records valued at significantly higher figures. The difference, across the 3 transactions, exceeded $30 million. The write-downs had been approved at the board level, with the approvals attributed to a financial oversight subcommittee chaired by one name: Richard Hale. Mark cross-referenced Hale's name against the company's public filings. Richard Hale was the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Operations at Sterling Capital Group, Victoria Sterling's second-in-command. Described in every company profile as her most trusted senior advisor, the man who had been beside her since the early days of the company. He had joined Sterling Capital 18 years ago, when the company was still small, and had grown with it. Mark dug deeper. He found that Hale's compensation package, detailed in a disclosure filed in connection with a real estate debt offering 2 years prior, included a performance bonus structure that was unusually tied to asset liquidation outcomes rather than revenue growth, a structure that created a direct financial incentive for undervaluing assets at disposition. He found that 2 board members who had previously questioned the methodology of the asset write-downs had quietly resigned within months of raising their concerns, one citing personal health reasons, one citing a desire to pursue other interests. Both had signed non-disclosure agreements as conditions of their departure packages. And he found that the unidentified man from the hotel surveillance footage, the one without a badge, the one who had been watching Victoria, matched the physical profile of a private security consultant whose name had appeared twice in company expense records filed under a contractor umbrella. Richard Hale, Mark understood now, was not Victoria Sterling's ally. He was her captor. The threat arrived on a Monday. Mark noticed the tail first, a gray sedan that appeared in his rearview mirror on 3 separate occasions over 2 days, always at a distance, always disappearing before he could confirm it. Then his 2 active freelance contracts were abruptly canceled within 48 hours of each other, both clients offering vague explanations about budget changes that rang false. Then, on a Wednesday night, while Lily was at a sleepover at a classmate's house, Mark came home to find his apartment door unlocked, not broken, not forced, simply unlocked, when he was certain he had locked it that morning. Nothing had been taken. His laptop was untouched, his files undisturbed, but sitting on the kitchen counter, on top of the mail he had left there before leaving, was a single sheet of paper with 2 words printed in the center: "Disappear now." Mark stood in his kitchen and read those words for a long time. He thought about Lily. He thought about what it would mean to simply pack 2 bags, drive to his sister's place in Cincinnati, and pretend he had never walked through the corridor of the Meridian Grand Hotel. He thought about that for approximately 20 minutes. Then he went to his desk, opened his laptop, and kept working. He did not stop because he knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had already thought it through, that disappearing would not make him safe. These were people who had silenced board members, manipulated financial records, and managed to monitor a billionaire CEO's every movement without leaving a traceable footprint. A man who walked away from what he knew still knew it. That made him a liability, regardless of whether he was in Chicago or Cincinnati. The only safe position was one where what he knew became public knowledge, where the information itself became his protection, because it was no longer exclusively in his hands. He called his sister and asked if Lily could stay with her for a few weeks, citing a work project that required travel. His sister agreed without asking too many questions, which was one of the things Mark had always loved about her. He drove Lily to the bus station on a Saturday morning, hugged her longer than usual, told her he loved her more than the whole city, and watched the bus pull away. Then he went back to work with the single-minded intensity of someone who had removed the last thing that could be used against him. Victoria contacted him again, 11 days after the parking structure. This time it was not an email. It was a handwritten note, slipped under the door of a workspace he rented by the day at a shared office, building a location he had never connected publicly to his name, accessible only through a subletting arrangement that ran through 2 intermediaries. Whoever had delivered the note had either been following him for days or had resources Mark had underestimated. The note contained a time, a location, and one sentence. "I have to tell you something about my father." They met in the back room of a Vietnamese restaurant in Pilsen, where Victoria had apparently established a prior relationship with the owner, under a different name, a contingency, Mark thought, that suggested she had been planning for the possibility of needing exactly this kind of meeting for longer than he had assumed. She told him about her father, William Sterling, who had founded Sterling Capital Group in the late 1980s and spent 30 years building it into the company it had become. He had died 6 years ago in a car accident on a mountain highway in Colorado, a 2-lane road he had driven dozens of times, in conditions that witnesses described as clear and dry. The official investigation had ruled it an accident. Victoria had accepted that ruling because there was nothing in the immediate evidence to suggest otherwise, and because grief does not always leave room for suspicion. But 2 years after her father's death, while reviewing old company files in preparation for a board restructuring, she had found something that had never been filed, never been disclosed, and apparently never been intended to surface: a memorandum from an internal risk assessment, dated 3 weeks before her father's death, in which William Sterling had documented his concerns about financial irregularities in the company's subsidiary accounts, and had noted his intention to commission an independent forensic audit. The memo had been addressed to 2 people. One of them was Richard Hale. The memo had disappeared from the company's document management system. Victoria had found it only because her father had kept a physical copy in a folder at the back of a filing cabinet in his private study. A cabinet she had not opened until 2 years after his death. She had confronted Hale indirectly, testing his reaction with references to her father's concerns, without revealing that she had the document. Hale's response had been smooth, immediate, and wrong in ways that she couldn't explain precisely but felt with absolute certainty. From that point forward, she had begun quietly investigating, and from that point forward, someone had begun quietly closing in on her. In the time since, 3 people who had been employed at Sterling Capital during her father's era, and who had been on Victoria's private list of potential interview subjects, had left the company. One had relocated to another state. One had taken an early retirement package. One had died of a heart attack at 53, an event that a physician would call unremarkable, and that Victoria Sterling found impossible to accept as coincidence. She believed Richard Hale had not merely been stealing from the company for 30 months. She believed he had been doing it, in one form or another, for much longer. And she believed he had known, 6 years ago, that her father was about to find out. Mark sat with this information for a long time after they parted that night. He walked home in the cold, and he thought about what kind of man he was being asked to go up against. And he thought about Lily on her bus, and his sister's kitchen, and the note on his counter that said disappear. He thought about all of it. And then he thought about a woman sitting in a locked company for 6 years, carrying knowledge that could kill her, watching the man she believed had murdered her father sit in the second chair and smile. He didn't disappear. The recovery took 9 days and involved a degree of technical precision that pushed the edges of what Mark had done in any professional context. Victoria had told him that her father's personal office computer, a machine William Sterling had used exclusively for sensitive correspondence, and had never connected to the company network, had been taken by Hale's team in the weeks following his death under the pretense of standard estate administration. She had managed, through the same quiet maneuvering that had characterized her survival over the past 2 years, to locate the machine's physical destination, a storage facility operated under a shell entity connected to one of Sterling Capital's dormant subsidiaries. Getting physical access to the machine required the kind of social engineering that Mark had not used since his early career. And it required 3 days of preparation. But he got in, and he got the drive, and he took it back to his workspace, and began the process of forensic reconstruction. The drive had been wiped thoroughly, professionally, using a method that most recovery tools would not penetrate. But Mark had access to a recovery technique he had developed during his years in corporate security, using a combination of open-source forensic software and his own reconstruction protocols that could extract partial data from sectors that had been overwritten fewer than 3 times. The wipe on this drive had been performed in a single pass. It was thorough enough to fool a standard investigation. It was not thorough enough to fool Mark Davis, working alone at 2 in the morning with nothing to lose. Over the following days, he recovered a partial archive that contained 4 categories of material. The first was a series of emails between Richard Hale and 2 other Sterling Capital senior executives, spanning a period of 6 years, in which the structure of the asset manipulation scheme was discussed in language that was coded but, in context, unmistakable references to adjustments, corrections, and realignments that corresponded precisely to the anomalous write-downs Mark had already identified in the public filings. The second was a set of internal financial documents showing fund transfers between subsidiary accounts and a series of offshore holding entities, with Hale's authorization signature on each transfer. The third was an audio recording partial, degraded, but recoverable enough for content of a meeting in which voices Mark could not identify by name discussed the timing of the forensic audit William Sterling had proposed and the necessity of ensuring that audit never occurred. The fourth was the original memorandum Victoria's father had written, in full, along with a handwritten annotation at the bottom, in a different hand that read, simply, "This cannot go forward." Mark did not know whose handwriting it was. He did not need to. He and Victoria spent 3 evenings organizing and verifying the material. Victoria brought her own documentation, the physical copy of the memo, her records of the canceled meeting requests, the non-disclosure agreements from the departed board members, which she had obtained through a lawyer operating under strict confidentiality. They assembled a package that covered 6 years of financial manipulation, the structural dismantling of William Sterling's authority in the period before his death, the post-death consolidation of Hale's power, and the ongoing campaign to isolate and control Victoria. They made multiple encrypted copies. They distributed those copies to 3 separate secure locations. They contacted a journalist and a securities attorney through channels clean enough that neither communication could be intercepted before it arrived. And then they waited for the Sterling Capital Group annual shareholder conference, scheduled for the 2nd Friday of the following month. The event was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Meridian Grand Hotel, the same room, the same corridor where Mark Davis had been carrying a tool bag 3 months earlier, when a woman had looked at him and moved her fingers and changed both of their lives. The irony was not lost on either of them, though neither mentioned it. Richard Hale arrived that morning, looking exactly as he had always looked. Composed, polished, radiating the particular confidence of a man who had spent years constructing a reality around himself that he had come to mistake for truth. The morning session had proceeded without incident. The quarterly numbers were presented. There was applause in the appropriate places. Hale spoke briefly about the company's strategic direction, and his tone had the casual authority of someone who already considered himself the next CEO at transition. He had been quietly orchestrating through board communications for the past 8 weeks, positioning himself as the steady hand needed to guide the company in what he had been framing, in private conversations, as a period of reduced confidence in the current leadership. Victoria Sterling was not on the scheduled program. Her communications team had indicated she would be absent from the public session due to ongoing health considerations. Hale had used this to his advantage in 3 separate meetings that week, suggesting to key board members that her condition was more serious than had been disclosed, and that a leadership transition plan needed to be accelerated. She walked in during the afternoon session, 40 minutes before it was scheduled to end. The reaction in the room was involuntary and immediate, a collective shift in attention, the specific silence that occurs when something has happened that was not supposed to happen. She was dressed with the precision of someone who had chosen every element of her appearance with deliberate intention, and she walked to the front of the room with the bearing of a person who has been afraid for a long time and has decided, today, to be done with it. The board members at the front table looked at each other. Hale's expression, Mark noted from his position near the audio-visual station at the back of the room, where he had spent the morning, cycled through several things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, a rapid reassessment that never quite settled into calm. Victoria took the microphone. She thanked the attendees for their patience. She said she had something to share with the shareholders that required their full attention. She nodded once, toward the back of the room. Mark pressed a key on the laptop connected to the presentation system. The main screen, a 12-foot display behind the front podium, came to life. The emails appeared first, organized chronologically, with the names and authorization signatures visible. Then the financial transfer documents, with the offshore entity structures mapped visually, in a way that made the pattern impossible to misread. Then the audio file, played at room volume, the voices discussing the forensic audit and the necessity of preventing it. Then the memorandum, William Sterling's original words, in full, and the handwritten annotation at the bottom. Then a final document, a forensic accounting summary prepared by an independent firm, commissioned 6 weeks ago through Victoria's attorney, confirming that the total funds moved through the manipulation scheme over a 12-year period exceeded $90 million. The room did not make a sound for approximately 15 seconds. Then it made several sounds at once. Richard Hale stood. His first response was what Mark had anticipated: controlled, lawyerly, the language of a man who had faced difficult moments before and survived them by reframing the facts with sufficient confidence. He described the documents as fabricated, the audio as manipulated, the entire presentation as a desperate attempt by a destabilized executive to deflect attention from her own failures. He was calm. He was articulate. He was, Mark thought, genuinely skilled at this, at the performance of innocence under pressure. There was even a moment, watching Hale from the back of the room, when Mark understood why this man had lasted as long as he had. He was persuasive not through bombast but through the quiet, reasonable presentation of an alternative version of reality, delivered with just enough certainty to create doubt in anyone who hadn't spent weeks living inside the actual truth. But he was speaking into a room that was already looking at the documents on the screen. And the documents were not fabricated, and the people in that room were sophisticated enough to understand the difference between a claim of fabrication and actual evidence of it. They were board members, institutional investors, senior executives, people whose entire professional value rested on their ability to read financial documents and evaluate what they saw. They had all been in rooms where someone stood at a podium and tried to explain away an inconvenient truth. They knew what that looked like. And they knew, with the particular clarity of people whose own money was involved, when what they were seeing could not be explained away. The questions from board members came quickly and did not stop. The securities attorney Victoria had contacted 3 weeks earlier, was present, and rose to speak. The journalist had published that morning, coordinating the release to coincide precisely with the conference. Within the hour, 2 board members who had been receiving Hale's private communications called for an emergency session. Richard Hale left the podium. He did not leave the building on his own. There were 2 federal agents waiting in the lobby who had been briefed by the securities attorney the previous day, operating on the basis of the financial documents provided in advance. They were patient, professional, and entirely unmoved by anything Hale said to them during the 40 minutes he spent attempting to explain why everything they had was wrong. He was wrong about that. The weeks that followed moved with the swift, grinding momentum of institutional consequence. Richard Hale was arrested and charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, a list of charges that the attorney handling the case described as conservative, with the likely addition of further counts as the forensic accounting expanded. 2 of his co-conspirators, both senior executives at Sterling Capital subsidiaries, were named in the same filing and placed on administrative leave within hours of the charges being made public. A third, who had apparently been aware of the scheme's origins and had chosen silence in exchange for his own financial benefit, reached out to investigators through his own attorney before the end of the first week. The board of Sterling Capital Group convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to affirm Victoria Sterling's authority as CEO and to commission an independent review of all board decisions made in the previous 3 years. The process of unwinding what Hale had constructed was going to take time. The lawyers said months, possibly years. Victoria understood this. She had spent 6 years watching the architecture of a lie being built around her. And she had realistic expectations about how long it takes to dismantle one. There would be depositions, discovery proceedings, the slow institutional grind of forensic accounting teams working backward through a decade of carefully obscured transactions. There would be civil suits filed by shareholders and regulatory inquiries from the SEC, and quiet, difficult conversations between Victoria and the board members who had, knowingly or not, allowed the conditions for all of this to persist. She did not resent those conversations. They were necessary, and she had learned, across the previous 6 years, that the hardest conversations are almost always the necessary ones. But the center of it, the man at the center of it, was no longer inside her company. He was no longer in her building. He was no longer in a position to reach her. For the first time in 6 years, she sat in her father's office, which had always technically been her office, but which she had avoided in the way that places of grief are avoided, and felt something that took her a moment to identify. It was not triumph. It was quieter than that. It was the particular relief of a person who has carried something alone for too long and has finally, at significant cost, set it down. She sat there for a long time, in the chair her father had sat in, looking out the window at the city that had built and broken and rebuilt her family's name. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private, years ago. In moments she had allowed herself and then sealed away. What she felt now was something closer to stillness, the specific stillness of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, when you are still standing and the air has finally gone quiet. She gave her first public interview 3 weeks after the conference. The journalist who conducted it had been present in that ballroom, and was one of the few people in the room who had understood, in real time, exactly what they were watching. He was a careful man who had spent 20 years covering corporate America, and had developed a finely tuned sense for the difference between managed narrative and lived truth. He asked her the questions any journalist would ask about the scheme, about the charges, about the future of Sterling Capital Group, and her plans for the company in the wake of what had been, by any measure, one of the most dramatic corporate governance failures of the decade. She answered them with the measured precision that had always characterized her public communication, offering enough to satisfy, without offering more than she intended. Near the end of the interview, he asked a question that had not appeared in the submitted list. Who had helped her? Not the attorney, not the journalist, not the independent accounting firm, the person who had started it. The person who had made the difference when it seemed impossible to make one. Victoria Sterling paused. She looked at a point somewhere past the interviewer's shoulder, at nothing in particular, with an expression that was difficult to read, and that the journalist would later describe in his written piece as the most unguarded moment she had allowed during the entire conversation. It was the expression of someone revisiting a memory that still carried weight, not grief, not joy, but the particular gravity of a moment that had altered the course of things. Then she smiled, small, genuine, nothing performed about it. She said only that someone had been paying attention when no one else was. She did not give a name. She had asked, in advance, that no name be given. Mark Davis did not want to be in the story. He had been clear about that, and Victoria had respected it completely. Mark, for his part, had returned to something that resembled his former life before the dust had fully settled. He picked Lily up from his sister's house on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after the conference, helped her carry her overnight bag to the truck, and listened to her detailed account of everything she had done during her extended visit, a school project, a movie her cousin had taken her to, a particular kind of pancake her sister made. That was, according to Lily, the best pancake in human history. A claim she defended at length, and with total conviction for approximately 11 minutes of the 40-minute drive back into the city. He drove home through the city with the window cracked, and the radio on low and Lily's voice filling the cab. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the specific lightness of a man who has done what he was supposed to do, and can now simply go home. He had expected nothing from Victoria beyond what had already happened. He had made his own choices at every step, without promises or guarantees, And the outcome had been the one he had hoped for, which was more than he had allowed himself to expect during the worst of it. He was surprised, then genuinely, quietly surprised, in the way that people who have learned not to expect things are surprised when something good arrives without warning. When Victoria's attorney called him on a Tuesday morning and asked if he would be available for a meeting at the Sterling Capital offices the following week. He assumed it was paperwork, something to formalize his role in the evidence collection, perhaps, or a legal formality related to the case. He arrived at the offices in a clean jacket and his best pair of boots, which was still not the kind of thing most people wore to the 42nd floor of a Michigan Avenue skyscraper. But it was what he had. Victoria met him in a conference room with large windows and a view of the lake that Mark found difficult not to look at. She thanked him, in the direct and unembellished way that had come to feel characteristic of her no excessive language. No performance of gratitude, just the plain acknowledgement of one person to another that something important had been done and that it mattered. She said that without him, none of what had happened would have been possible, which was accurate but felt too simple for what it meant. And then she told him she had a position she needed to fill. Sterling Capital Group's Director of Information Security, a role that had existed in name only for the past 3 years, staffed by people who had ultimately been loyal to Hale's operation, rather than to the company's actual interests. She needed someone who understood systems from the inside out, who approached every architecture not with the assumption that it was functioning but with the professional habit of looking for what was wrong. Someone with integrity that had been demonstrated under conditions that most integrity tests do not include, not in a controlled environment, not under the supervision of a compliance team, but alone, in the middle of the night, with real consequences attached to every decision. Someone who was very good at finding things that had been deliberately hidden and who had the stubbornness to keep looking even when everything suggested he should stop. Mark looked at the lake for a moment. He thought about Lily's pancake speech. He thought about his second-hand truck and his late rent and the tool bag he had been carrying through a hotel corridor when a woman had looked at him and changed everything. He thought about the man he was and the man he was trying to be, and whether those two things were now, finally, close enough together that the distance between them didn't hurt. He thought about the email that had arrived on a Thursday night, and the parking structure in the cold, and the note on his kitchen counter. He thought about driving Lily to the bus station and watching the bus pull away and telling himself it was temporary, that it would be fine, that he was doing the right thing even when it had felt like the loneliest decision of his life. He thought about 9 days of forensic reconstruction at 2 in the morning, fueled by gas station coffee and the stubborn refusal to look away from something that mattered. And he thought about Victoria Sterling walking into that ballroom the way she had walked, the way a person walks when they have finally decided that fear will not have the last word. He said yes, the day a billionaire secretly signed "Help Me" to a struggling single dad was the day both of their lives changed forever.